though this is already our third or so event on transport and logistics this year, but this is a particular focus on supply chain technology, so we do see quite a number of new faces that are joining us this afternoon. So to those who are not yet aware of SGInnovate, we are an investment fund that focuses on deep tech startups. So we invest in and help build startups that employ AI, medtech, quantum technologies across industry, of which transport and logistics is a major focus for us here. And a big part of our work is to bring together the ecosystem that comprises corporates and SMEs, startups and investors, government and international partners to share knowledge and discuss collaboration opportunities to enable the commercialization of innovative technologies. Our event today focuses specifically on new business models and startup technologies that could potentially impact the future of logistics in Singapore and the world. And we are bringing together a very, very nice lineup of global thought leaders who have just flew into Singapore and joined us as of this morning. And it is even more special because today we are witnessing the signing of the very first Memorandum of Understanding between SGInnovate and Reefknot Ventures, as well as with our global industry experts from Kone & Nagel and the former head of Transport and Logistics Technology Group at the World Economic Forum. The signing will commemorate the establishment of the very first Global Emerging Supply Chain Technologies think tank. The purpose is to, first of all, raise the awareness and the readiness in the industry about new business model and startup technologies in the sector. And second, we want to act as a platform for startups who can potentially disrupt and impact the industry by working together with collaborators and corporates in the ecosystem. So without further ado, I would now like to invite the masterminds behind this very nice initiative to join us on the stage for a very nice Memorandum of Understanding signing. First, could I have Mark, who is Managing Director of Reefknot Ventures, to join us on the stage. And Mr. Pang Heng Soon, who is head of our venture building team at SGInnovate, who work with many startups from commercialization perspectives. And of course, our industry experts who very nicely joined us today, Simon from Kone & Nagel, corporate development team, and Wolfgang, who was previously the global head of Transport and Logistics Technology. Please, let us give everyone a warm welcome as they walk us through the signing. Gentlemen, please. It's going to be over in just a blink of an eye, so please take a good look at the moment where we make things happen here. It looks like it's all set. We'll just have one quick photo taking before our panel discussion commences. All right, thank you very much. All right, now I'll pass the mic to Mark, who will take us through the next part of the event that everyone is waiting for. Mark, please.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks everybody for coming by this evening. Right, We've got a very special lineup for you guys, which is very rarely do you see such a distinguished, panel of speakers and thought leaders in their own right. This is actually we're kickstarting this global thought leadership body, right? And interestingly enough, only 2 out of the 5, that are signing on this actually are out of Singapore. The rest of them are actually overseas. One of which will be is actually in the US that can't join us. So let me just do a quick introduction of the panel and the topic for discussion today. So over here we have Simon, who's head for corporate development global head for corporate development for Kuehne+Nagel, who also heads up strategy for KN. Heng Soon heads up the venture building for SGInnovate, and Wolfgang was the former supply chain and transport head for the World Economic Forum. So to kickstart today's panel discussion, what we'll do is that we'll go through about 5 to 8 minutes for each of the individuals, and then I'll ask some questions, and I'll open up questions from the floor, right, for you guys to ask either for everybody on stage or individually to each of the individual members. So let me start with Wolfgang. Right, you've been involved with the World Economic Forum for some time, right? It'll be interesting to hear what you have to say about, and the work that you did around the forum as head for supply chain logistics, and especially what do you see in terms of new models and technologies and opportunities in this space, right? Wolfgang?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. I spent 4 years at the World Economic Forum, so this is a long time and it's a long list. I will focus on a few highlights. When I joined, we worked on a report which was called Beyond Supply Chains, and this was about ethical behavior in supply chain. I think it's a very interesting read. The forum reports are downloadable for free. There is a wealth of information. There are 31 cases. In parallel, we worked on a report on reports about enabling trade. Singapore is a trade hub, so also very, very interesting. There are a series of reports on enabling trade. We focused on Brazil, we focused on Mexico, Africa, Vietnam. This was let's say the more trade and ethical, responsible behavior side. The other main block was on technology. The first was, strangely, it was on the Belt and Road. And although I wrote my first article on the Belt and Road 2015, the space and the discussion became very, very crowded. And so I thought, we worked on this with Bain, I thought it would be good to look at the Belt and Road through the digital lens. And some of you, or maybe everybody knows, there are multiple roads. There is the sea route, which is in fact the road, and then there is the belt, which is the land bridge between Asia and Europe. And then there is the Arctic Silk Road, and then there's the Information Silk Road, which in fact not a lot of people talk about, which is about satellites and oversea cables, and which is also somehow at the center of the US-China tensions, because it is about communication networks, and if you control communication networks, this is very important for national security, etc. So we wrote a paper which was more or less the digital Silk Road, and thinking about how can blockchain, for example, help to create marketplaces, dynamic marketplaces for capacity on the trains, but also for capacity in factories. Then another paper was on trade tech, on trade finance, where I found that most of the unmet financing needs are in fact in Asia Pacific, and in particular with SMEs. So the trade finance gap is about 1.5, 1.6 trillion US dollar per year. And the SMEs have a lot of challenges because there is an issue with the KYC, know your customer. There is no data, there is no track record. I think this is a very interesting field for startups to work on. And there are multiple angles to it. It can be sliced in very different ways. And then I add two other papers which are in the field of tech. The one is on additive manufacturing and more or less the impact of additive manufacturing or 3D printing on supply chain. So it's about, in fact, decentralization of manufacturing. Also an important topic, and a very controversial debate around it, what will be the impact. But I personally believe, first, it's not new. It's a very old technology because layering material is much more economic than cutting material off and producing waste. But I think in the future, in the space of e-commerce, where it's about tailoring products to individual needs, 3D printing plays a very important role in supply chains, and you need to move and you can, the production very close to the customer, which cut down lead times. And the last paper, I'd say two things. One was on a series of blockchain in supply chain. We did an introduction paper. I co-authored this, and then I contributed to 3 other papers. One is private and public. If you are unclear what is blockchain, and a lot of people are, we have in the group of experts, and I'm still part of this group, about probably 25 to 35 experts, and I think we have no consensus, but I think we have a nice spectrum of what the topic is about. So we did one introduction paper, we did one on public and private, we did one on digital identity. Digital identity, another very important topic for supply chain and logistics, because you want to know with whom you are dealing in the digital world, and if you have autonomous agents who are dealing with each other, you need to have a very solid digital identity. And the latest paper, which was published last week, is about data protection, another very interesting thing. So, and the last paper, which I did last year, was on 6 Latin American countries, the state of the supply chain 4.0 in terms of awareness and application. That's what we looked at. Are people aware? And are they applying supply chain 4.0 technologies? And you see, read the paper. And we benchmarked it against markets like the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Korea, and Japan.
Thanks for going. Oh, that's a lot of stuff. Maybe it'll be quite interesting to get back to you later around blockchain, supply chain, and especially supply chain 4.0. Right? Your thoughts around emerging markets and how startups can play in that space. That might be interesting to get back to later. Heng Soon, to you next, right? You have got a lot of experience around, helping and looking and working with logistics tech startups in this part of the world and globally, actually. So it'll be good to hear your perspective of, logistics tech startups in this current environment, and how do you actually track, or how do you actually identify differentiating capabilities in these startups for you to be interested and to invest in and to grow with them?
Hi, good afternoon. I live and work in the startups world, so my interaction with this logistics industry is from that external perspective of technology vendors, that provide solutions and or services to players in the supply chain. So if you follow the news about venture capital investments globally into logistics and related area, if you look back maybe about 10 years or so, roughly globally about US close to 20 billion, 20 billion has been invested. It's about high teens, close to 20 billion. And rough 80-20 rule, 80% of that 20B were invested in the last 5 years or less. So that curve where there's deployment, there's lots of technology ideas and attracting lots of money, it's recent, relatively speaking, and it also, one can also then debate and infer that the opportunities are still there. It is still new enough. So for winners to emerge on the vendor side, for the suppliers of technology and solutions, as well as on the user side, the logistic players who are looking for such solutions for better efficiency and effectiveness. So that's a trend. Now, logistics is a very big word. There's so many subsegments. I do not come from the industry, but from an observer's perspective, you can break it up into a few blocks. Right. For example, the freight forwarding, which is essentially making goods go from one place to another, usually from manufacturers, from one place to a buyer or a distributor in a different place, far away, across sea, rail, ships, or whatever. There's at any one point in time, things that are being shipped are not shipped 24 hours, every single minute of the day and all the time. They are stopped at somewhere. Warehousing is another kind of a key block in the logistics sector. Closer to every one of us as consumers, end consumers, would be e-commerce. Right. E-commerce itself, is a big, e-commerce logistics is a big space, of which there are several, things. And there are also lots of other, supporting software and services that feed into each one of these. All right. And the key trends, the key tech areas that Wolfgang has also mentioned, a lot of artificial intelligence coming into play, blockchain is coming into play, robotics and automation, so, and IoT, right, knowing where things are at any one point in time. So all these are coming into play and they intersect. I would look to Mark's question as to what I'm kind of, how do I begin looking, would be not from, I don't come from the technology, although I am tech, but I do not want to come from the tech angle. I come from the needs angle. And I have to be specific in terms of the need to a specific subsegment, which I mentioned, of the entire logistics industry. One has to be very specific because it's a very complicated and complex industry. It has to be because it's big, it's geographically global by design, and it ships everything and anything you can think of that we use. All right, so it's truly global. So, and in this big thing, you have to be very specific, and I look for very clear problems, and hopefully the solution presented to me has a distinct and well-defined enough value proposition, and that's a starting point. Going back to how do you know which need to which segment, subsegment, it helps a lot. And I think it is a very key competitive advantage if the team, one or more members of the founding team, actually comes or has experience from the logistics sector. Because a lot of people can write code, but you write code doesn't mean you know how to do logistics. So that's how I begin to approach things that come to me.
Thanks, Ing-Soon, and maybe after we get back to you on, you mentioned about AI and blockchain and stuff like that. It'll be interesting to see, because you do global investments, right? Maybe there's some interesting trends around, what are interesting technologies or founders that you found in Singapore versus in, if different parts of the world, Israel or, London, San Fran, whether there's a trend around where some of these technologies are coming out, right? So I think maybe we'll get back to you on that. But off to Simon, right? And, Simon is in a interesting position as, the head for corporate development for Kuehne+Nagel, and he also heads up the strategy part of it as well. So, it'll be, Simon, what's your perspective of digitization and AI relating to a traditional supply chain and the logistics industry in general, and maybe more specifically for KN, right? So how do you see these startups? How do you see these business models and technologies evolving? And how does KN react to that, right? Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. You saved the best for last. So I have sort of three premises that I want to start out with, and I'll qualify each of them. So hopefully you have an understanding of what Kuehne+Nagel is. If not, we are the dinosaur in the industry, 100+ years of freight forwarding, as just vividly described. So the three premises I want to start out with is, the first one is trade is good. The second one is trade is networks, and the last one is trade is sexy. I deliberately talk about trade because trade is the underlying mechanism whereby our business model sits. So when I talk about trade is good, that is a fundamental belief that we have as an organization. And unfortunately, what we're seeing at the moment is that trade is actually becoming more and more difficult. And you could say and argue short term that might make life easier for us as an intermediary acting in this environment, but we believe sustainably for the wealth of the globe, that is actually in everybody's interest to lower those barriers. And if we start talking about use cases that are interesting later on, that would be one of the ones that I would sort of be my ask towards some of the interesting startups out there. The second one around networks is that not every network is equal. And when I talk about networks in trade, it's within a country, it's between countries. And when we start looking, and I can only echo what you talked about before, is that we're looking for the specific use cases. So the tech almost becomes secondary. We're actually looking for what are the real world needs that are out there that needs to be solved. And what we sometimes see is that it becomes tech for the sake of tech. I think everybody can talk about blockchain solutions that have taken some time to evolve and become sort of relevant and solve real life use cases. So it's around the networks. And that also means that if you look at the different countries and networks that are out there, different use cases can be applied differently in different networks. It means that a problem that is solved in one market can be transferred to another market and become an entirely different solution. So when we look at some of the startups, we also see that maybe something that has been solved in terms of warehousing solutions in the US might become a completely different and interesting solution in an emerging market in Asia. And the last one, sort of the catchy trade is sexy, is that we are not only seeing a lot of capital coming into the market, but what is really, really interesting for the industry is that we are seeing a lot of talent coming in to our industry, which, if you look at a very traditional industry, it's an incredible boost to see people coming in with a very diverse set of backgrounds, trying to solve the many, many different challenges and use cases that are there in the industry. So I think that bodes really, really well for the future of logistics. So that's a little bit as a starting point.
Thanks, Simon. So for the audience, there's electronic Q&A. You can pose some questions, and I'll get it, and I'll ask the panelists, right? But in the meantime, while we wait for some additional questions from the audience, Wolfgang, going back to you, right? You talked about supply chain 4.0. Blockchain in supply chains is another interesting, topic, especially when it relates to startups and new technologies and new business models. You think that there's actually a room for startups to play in this? Is it commercially viable, for startups to play in this space? What's your research say, and what's your, your interactions with startups in your current capacity? Some perspectives, yeah.
Yeah, there is definitely room to play for startups. I'm in the supply chain and transport industry for about a few decades, and a lot has happened. But from a technology point of view, when I left my corporate role about 10 years ago, I tried to push technology, but this was an uphill battle, We managed to implement some handhelds. We did some tests with RFID. I believe that corporates need startups to do the work in technology, because the corporates are so big. They're so big. They have so much heritage. So that's one angle to look at it. The other is there are so many unsolved problems. I'm always surprised when I hear people saying that there is end-to-end visibility on shipments. There is no end-to-end visibility on shipments. There is not even visibility from the local city depot to the shop. And I just heard this morning in the launch in Hong Kong, where somebody told me he has been approached by a very large FMCG company because they have no visibility where the things are. Last week, I spoke with an advisor to Airbus. Same story. They don't know where the parts of the plane are. So I think that if we talk about unsolved problems, end-to-end visibility in supply chain is a big, big topic. And it's not the fault of the industry that it didn't happen. And it's also not the industry that should solve it. Maybe I step on some toes here, but what you need is IoT. You need IoT devices, you need sensors informing you about location, which is also not a given because communication networks are not full coverage worldwide. But you can then use AI to make approximation, for example. You can use sensors to understand the conditions, shock, temperature, humidity, you name it. So these technologies, they are pretty young. I started to work with a startup in 2010 on IoT devices, but at that time the devices were very bulky. We had no certification for aviation. The communication was pretty limited. So this is just one example, and I can talk about others too. And the startups, they need to figure out, and it's not one, it's many startups need to figure out how to get the devices to the right place, how to pick the devices up when they are not used. Just considering that, for example, Maersk spent $1 billion to move empty containers, you can say, okay, I want to monitor them, but maybe you don't. And maybe a startup can create synergies by combining different carriers and use the devices in a much more efficient way. And that's, I think it's a long example, but it shows there is so much room to play for startups, and there's so much to win for corporates if they know how to cooperate with startups.
Thanks, Wing. So let's hook onto this topic a little bit further on, and like to ask Simon on this as well, which is around the topic of supply chain visibility, right? Is really the supply chain visible, right? End-to-end visibility, you know, how much of it is visible, how much of it is not, what's the difficulty in this space, right? Even before you get into planning and optimizing, you know, there's a visibility part of it. And maybe Heng Soon afterwards can chime in a little bit in terms of the startups that you look at, you know, from a differentiated technology perspective. Is it on the obtaining visibility part of it, be it devices or blockchain, or is it planning optimization after that, right? So maybe to Simon, your point first, to you first, supply chain visibility, KN perspective, do you have full visibility? And if not, what's the, you know, how do you actually answer that question, right? Yeah.
So allow me to be a little bit provocative. So I think absolutely nobody has full end-to-end visibility today. And what we actually find that when we speak to our customers is today, even if we did, they wouldn't know what to do with it because their processes are not set up to deal with it. So once you actually get it, it's nice to look at in a historic report. You look at last month, last quarter, but that doesn't really do you any good. And I think this is really where startups can play, because if you can turn that visibility into better decision making, change processes, you change the routing, you change sort of where you put the goods, that is when it becomes really interesting. That's when it's game changing. Until then, and I think if you look at sort of supply chain, what's high on everybody's wish list for the last 10 years, visibility has always been up there, but it's really what do you turn it into? And I think that's where startups can play, because that's difficult for someone like us to actually play in that space short term.
Maybe just one experience. If you work with IoT startups, if you are an IoT startup and you implement an IoT solution, the first day the customer is very happy. After a week, he says, I cannot handle the data. And they just, because they need analytics, meaning you need products. You need to build products on this. For example, a product could be you have 50,000 data sets, AI picks the 5 which are relevant, and these 5 pop up at the desk or the digital desk of the decision maker.
And Heng Soon, you know, your perspective in terms of, you know, some of the technologies in terms of visibility, or is it visibility is a problem, or is it after, you know, where do you see that?
I will stay on the visibility topic. Yes, agreed. And for a lot of traditional, long-time players in the industry, you know, that's what they are trying to solve. From the venture world, there are some, you know, companies out there who start new companies start with a digital-first freight, like a digital-first freight forwarder. You know, you can Google digital-first freight forwarder and you come up with likes of Flexport and a couple of others. I'm not promoting any company in particular. So that's, and the claim that they make obviously is of it, you know, better visibility. From a closer, you know, at hand kind of experience, we have an investment in a company in the UK. It's an AI startup that helps to give flexibility to the biggest company in the world that supplies pallets for shipment. Pallets, the stuff, the squarish thing that you put the stuff on, all right? And there are millions and millions out there. You don't know, where are they? How many do you have near you? Because no, this company, the biggest company is called CHAP, all right? It's a subsidiary of a company called Brambles. So in a country, any country, they will have certain operational centers, all right? And they will have to make sure they have enough to cover, you know, their area of operations. Problem is, they don't know exactly how many they have at the one point in time, and complicated by the issue that can they predict how many they need next week, the week after? On what basis do they predict? Big data? Really? Is it big data or is it something else? You know, is it just pure hard machine learning or other things involved. I think in our case, the company that we have invested in, they found that deep learning, brute force machine learning is not the solution. It is contributor to the solution, but another part of the solution is what you call probability mathematics, analytics, of which there are several kind of sciences involved. So you predict based on probability what is going to happen next week. And therefore, you give the company that's supplying pellets, it could be a small company, it could be the biggest company in the world, the ability to know what they have now and what they ought to have next week. All right.
Okay, so I'm going to take some questions from the floor, right? I think the first question for the panel is random. Okay, so first question for the panel is this. Now, there are a few startups utilizing blockchain to replace the Bow of Leyden, right, aimed at improving costs and speed. Do you think that the industry is ready for this disruption? And that's the first question. And the second one, also relating to that, is with regards to technologies like blockchain and new models coming out, right? How open is the industry for adopting, new and unconventional pricing models, right? So maybe, Simon, you want to take the Bill of Lading question, and maybe Wolfgang? Yeah.
Sure, I'll take the Bill of Lading question. So I'm not an expert particularly on the Bill of Lading, but what I think it goes towards is the fact that there are very few standards in our industry. And whether it's a bill of lading or whether it's commercial invoices or standardized packing lists and so on, it is very difficult to get all the parties together and agree on standards. So I think the underlying technology, I think a lot of parties are actually very interested in utilizing these, and therefore you also see that there are quite a few specific to blockchain. There are quite a few blockchain consortiums out there between shippers, forwarders, shipping lines, and so on, trying to establish some of these standards. So I think the willingness is there to use the technology. I think that the challenge is really to establish standards.
Okay, thanks. How about from the pricing model perspective, new models and coming out with new technologies, do you see new pricing models that are emerging that is different from before, either freemium or instead of services, it becomes a product kind of a play, right? Any?
Yeah, no, I see new pricing models emerging. Maybe not on the forwarder level, but on the carrier level, definitely. And this is an easier shot than the blockchain shot. So this is about unlocking profits. It's about having better profitability per vessel, per plane, etc. This is highly attractive, and then some CEOs jump over this hurdle and say, we do this now, right? There is a lot of money involved. With the blockchain, no, industry not ready, blockchain industry not ready, logistics industry not ready, economy not ready. Because there is a big issue with the governance of the whole thing. If you read the last paper, which is about protection of data, applying a GDPR lens, which is the privacy protection law of the EU, it's not addressed. So there is no regulation which addresses blockchain. So you always have an enormous risk to be uncompliant. So that's one thing. Another thing is blockchain is very complex. So very few people understand it. Even if you read the white papers, it's not clear because it is enabling technology. It's like the Intel Inside. There is, in fact, a lot of blockchain already around, but not for the reasons it was originally designed, but just as an IT tool to decentralize data management and have one global truth and one shared truth. And I think there so behind the curtain, blockchain exists. If you put it on the stage, everybody, at least half of the people will say, oh no, not blockchain again, because a very disappointing topic. So not ready, but still there, my point on the blockchain.
Thanks. I think so.
Yeah.
Maybe a last point on paperless supply chains. 30 years ago, I worked on a project, paperless supply chain. We were very successful if we look at the paper of supply chain, but definitely the industry, if it could get rid of the paper, would do it. But here, ask customs what they need for paper, and then you hit again the wall. So there is a lot of need for new ways of collaboration to get the foundations and the prerequisites sorted out that such technology can legally and effectively be implemented. Sorry.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah. I was just in Germany last week and was meeting with some people from the Ministry of Economy and Technology. And I also met with a center in Berlin that is supposed to promote the use of, and it does, promote the use of blockchain. Now, this last place I visited, the guy who runs this, his first question to anyone who actually wants to say, I want to use blockchain, he asked the question, do you need a blockchain or do you need a database? Think first, what exactly do you want? All right. So going back to the, I'm not a pessimist about blockchain. We have several blockchain companies in my portfolio, right? So don't get me wrong. But the use case must be very clear. And the application of the technology must be very clear. Going back to the point about pricing models, perhaps not so much about pricing models, but an overall business model. Another part of the subsegment of the big logistics industry is last mile delivery, right? So again, very close to our individuals' hearts. You want it the day you want it, the time you want it, the place you want it, all right? And you want to be completely satisfied. And you do not want to pay a single extra cent for it. There's a whole ton of companies or startups worldwide in this last mile space. It's very, very fragmented. Right. So if you are running a business, if you provide a service, and it costs you, you need resources to provide that level of service. But if your top line you cannot increase the sales price. Your top line is assuming everything else is equal or steady, does not grow, but you are using resources to give the customer satisfaction. Somewhere inside your financial model, something has to give. All right. So it's a play on the financial model in totality. Right. Pricing has something to do with it, but it's also the whole complete financial model.
Thanks. Now, there are a lot of questions on the floor around things like for new technologies, how do corporates and traditional logistics companies, what do they view new technologies? Is it competitive, or how do they adopt it internally? Be it AI, deep learning, IoT, right? And how does traditional logistics businesses, perhaps use this technology or partner with others to transform in the next 5 to 10 years, right? So it's an open kind of a question. Where do you see the industry going? How much is being built by the corporates themselves versus working with startups in particular areas? And where is transformation going in the next 5 to 10 years and beyond? Just an open question.
Maybe I can start for the corporate part. So I think we've changed our view quite a bit when it comes to driving innovation. So we used to sort of look for the silver bullet in terms of this is the way to work with startups, this is a way to innovate within the business. And what we've come to realize is that we need several avenues of innovation, and one of them being Reefknot, where we are the one partner, the other one being Temasek. So we realized that we needed to, within the business, look at innovation, within the business cooperate with startups. We needed a venture fund. We have within our IT organization, we have innovation labs around the world. We have innovation centers. So we have many different avenues, and we have a much more pragmatic approach to it today. So in some of the systems and tools and solutions that we are developing today, we're looking at a combination of building ourselves, but also having the ability to plug in external solutions. So I think that's the big learning that we've had to come through the last couple of years.
Wolfgang, any?
Okay. In my corporate career, I was an innovator. If I had innovated, launched one new product in 2 or 3 years, I was already a hero. And it took me real force to convince people internally to change what they had built 20 years before. So that is a bit the challenge you have in the corporate world, because everything is fixed, everything works well, they are paid to be the best operators, and they are the best operator, but don't touch their machine. So, and if you launch 5 projects, don't do so many projects, because we have to keep the machine running, right? So that's my experience. So I wrote in a very, very intensely debated article, logistics companies are not tech companies. Wow. For some, this was a shock, because now every company in the world says it's a tech company. But I believe there is a big difference between Google and Kühne + Nagel, and between Google and Lufthansa. So Google is a tech company. So if you want to be the Google of the aviation industry, it cannot come from inside. So you have to do something very different. You have to build your own competitor. You have to build it outside. And as you don't have the people, because usually the best data scientists and the most creative brains don't go to corporates. They go to Google maybe, but I know very creative brains who say, no Google, please not. No Apple, please not. So they create their own company. And it was the chairman and CEO of Thales who said, you can invest as much money as you want in R&D. The best groundbreaking people are outside your company. So you have to work with startups outside. So, and I think more and more CEOs and boards understand this, and then do things like Kühne + Nagel is doing. And internally, it's in fact incremental innovation. We put a feature on a product. We put a new scanner on the sorter. We put a camera on the ramp. But where is the camera coming from? From the innovation center, which incubates startups, either coming from inside, sometimes there are people inside, coming from inside or the outside, and then helps them to develop something which works for, and you can read about this, about the innovation center of DHL, for example, right? And then they deliver services to DHL, but also to others. They become part of DHL or not. So I think that's the way things are going, and again, a lot of room for startups.
Heng Soon, maybe some perspectives from you as well, from a pure tech perspective versus business model disruption perspective, right? What's your perspective around, investing in pure tech for the, for that tool, like what Wolfgang mentioned, right? That incremental analytics feature in that button, right? Vis-a-vis business model that disrupts the industry or tech that disrupts the industry. Where do you see this going, as either from an investment perspective or from your experience of your portfolio companies?
I think they both work. The earlier example that I mentioned about the company that we have investment in the UK is one that spun out from a university. Right. One of its founders holds a chair in one of the departments in Cambridge University. Right. And one of the other co-founders was his student. So it had a tech. It was born out of technology. All right. Over many years of work, and. Actually, when it first came out, spun out from the university, because of, like I said, the combination of deep learning and probabilistic theory, it went after the autonomous vehicle application area. It combined machine learning with probabilistic theory with multi-agent theory to predict a whole mass of AVs, autonomous vehicles, moving all at the same time. When one changed, all the others will change, and once all the others change, everybody else will change. So continuously. So it was great mathematics. But the industry, the market is not here yet. That market is years away, right? You can put lots of money into it, but you're looking at perhaps a market window of maybe 10 years or more away. But that same science is applicable to present-day problems, right? And one of those that was found was in logistics, about knowing what you have and what you should have the next day or the next week. So I think that's the tech side of starts. How you can start, but then you kind of morph yourself or evolve into it. And many startups go through that journey. All right. There are also startups that, from day one, seek to disrupt. All right. And online shopping, because it's very related to e-commerce logistics, online shopping itself started to disrupt. Obviously, right? Don't go to a shop. Don't even go out of the house. Stay in your bed and shop. The technology then evolved. All right, and you can see that there is a lot of there are lots of online shops, right? Both the very big ones to the local ones. The big ones, many of the big ones have great internal vertical integration. They do a lot of stuff internally, all right? But there are a lot of startups who supply solutions into e-commerce shops not named Amazon. So you have places to play. So there are so many tiers in the industry, and KNN is tier 1. But the second tier, third tier, fourth tier, international, region, local, sea, or state. So I think the field is still open. And you can start both ways, from a tech or you go in and seek to disrupt.
Thanks. I think that's a deep topic for a drill down as well, right? Around startups working with the big tech, second tier, third tier, what areas do they zoom into? I think there's a lot of play there. From a Q&A perspective, I think there's a lot of questions that the audience are asking around blockchain. Everything from, to Heng Soon, pickup of blockchain enterprise tech startups from investors, investors going into blockchain, Wolfgang, to things like, how many do you see blockchain investments, being in production in large companies, right? And even to Simon around, the whole KN piece, how KN is building or will work in conjunction with your own, either work in conjunction with another blockchain network or build your own blockchain network. So I think in general, maybe what we'll do is that we'll do one round on blockchain, and then I'll ask one final question on my side, and then we'll sort of wrap up from there. So a question on blockchain, maybe Simon first. What's KN's perspective on blockchain? Are you building your own stuff? Are you willing to partner? Heng Soon, investments in blockchain, is that happening more so or less? Where do you see it? And Wolfgang, from an enterprise adoption perspective, from your research, right? How much of it actually is coming into fruition, right? Yeah.
So assuming that the challenges that Wolfgang outlined earlier sort of come to a point where it's actually a viable solution, our belief is quite straightforward, is that we have to subscribe to open standards. We cannot build and own our own proprietary blockchain. So it has to be open standards applicable to all. That's the only way that they will actually work and add value.
Yeah. First, blockchain in general, then blockchain as applied to logistics. Blockchain in general, from my venture perspective, to clarify, we don't do cryptocurrencies and exchanges, so we don't do speculative stuff. But we have investments in blockchain that enable others. For example, if you do trade or have digital assets, just like physical assets that you buy and sell, in the stock market or equity exchanges, you need a custodial solution, a custodial. In the traditional, there are big custodial banks. All right. In the blockchain world, this is just happening. You need to be licensed by the authorities, and we have an investment on that front. So it is an enabling. If you do transactions using you have cryptocurrency transactions, a fair bit of the discussion today on the current days is a lot of such transactions may have illegal motives or underpinnings. Right, not so good money, right? Dirty money, and it is hard to police. Right, you don't do the physical world sort of checks before you transact. You wire funds from one area, and there's no like pre-KYC stuff. So we have another company doing as real time as possible KYC for crypto transactions. So these are enabling things that we think, would have some use. All right. The jury is still out. These are early stage investments. In terms of trade, we have seen many in the last several years where trade financing was often the target market for blockchain startups. But we have not seen any succeed. So, we can have a discussion as to why that has not happened. All right. It has to do with truly opened for everybody, but these things have so far happened in isolation.
Yeah, very short. I'm a believer that trade finance is a great field for blockchain and it's distributed ledger technology. So blockchain is one with a lot of downsides as well. So you have a series of different technologies and distributed ledgers. And the issue in the finance sector is the standard. It's in fact the standard. It's getting all banks to agree on this. And although it's very often described as a very innovative industry, not a lot is happening. They are digitizing, in fact, existing processes to a large extent. There are blockchain companies, and they are successful, they are well-financed, so the technology works in some fields, without mentioning names, but again, look at the paper and you will see a lot of examples where blockchain can help. Okay, I can take one. Let's take TradeLens. TradeLens is an IBM platform for trade. There is a blockchain component. Some people believe the whole platform is blockchain. The whole platform is not blockchain. Nobody can tell me that you can run thousands of transactions on a platform, but there is a blockchain component. There is another company I know which is working with blockchain, but they say, you can do it that way, but if you want to have it blockchain, we can do it blockchain. So it is a kind of plus. Another CEO who is in fact in risk profile and reducing risk to improve financing conditions. In fact, blockchain can gradually, to a certain extent, reduce risk. And if you do that and you get a better interest rate, then that works. So I think, and you said it, it is the use case. It might be very narrow, but the blockchain is around. And yeah, distributed ledger is around.
Thanks, very insightful discussion on blockchain. Now, last question, I think, is from me. So bring it back to, the whole topic on global emerging market, global emerging business models and technologies, right? So final question for each of you. What are the 2 or 3 areas, that you think are either very interesting to look at when it comes to either emerging business models or technologies with respect to supply chain and logistics industry, right? What are the 2 or 3 things that, you would like, that think tank to zoom into over the next 12 months, right? We'll start with Simon and we'll go down.
So I think if you look at what's truly disruptive today in the industry, I would not point to technology, but I would point to consumer behavior. Consumer behavior is driving e-commerce, and e-commerce is having a significant impact on our business, both when you look at the business of air freight, the business of warehousing. So if you want to look at some specific use cases that would be interesting for startups to dig into, and here I speak purely from a personal opinion, overconsumption. I think this would be a fantastic area for startups to dig into. Second one, and we haven't touched upon this, is around sustainability. How can startups support and influence sustainable supply chains? That would be my 2 asks.
Yeah. Before I answer, I would like to have you, Mark, also answer this question, since running Reefknot, which is a joint venture investment fund with Temasek. Very important for me to learn from you too. I subscribe to the point about sustainability, all right, and the level of waste that is right now happening, especially e-commerce. Just think of reducing the number of returns by half. Can you do that? Right? How best to do that? So all this needs effort. The other one thing that perhaps we can think about is there are a lot of software tech companies that come forward with, and they could be targeting the logistics sector or any other sector. They have this very light, asset-like business model of, here's a subscription-based solution. Sign up and onboard and you do it. But in the world of logistics, a large part of it also involves a physical world. And a lot of startups also are starting to go into there versus the traditional software-only kind of thing, which is quick and easy, relatively speaking, but they are into software and hardware. AVs that run around either on campus, in the factory floor, or on city streets, right? Or on the road, or in the air, drones, for example. So it is a mix of the business model. To me, I'm not very clear on the business model as to asset-light, asset-heavy, or more asset-intensive kind of place, the venture world. But remember to answer this question yourself.
Okay, maybe I'll put a comment there first before we. So, thanks for asking me a question, so I got to actually think and answer something. I'll comment a little bit about that asset-heavy, asset-light, startups starting from one end, be it service and building assets, or assets and then going into service. And generally, from a Reefknot perspective, right? We don't necessarily go into asset-heavy type investment. That means, pure hardware type of thing. No, we not necessarily that it's not a good investment. It's just that it's not within our mandate. Right? We prefer slightly lighter. So we've had experiences of IoT companies, for example, that start off, just selling widgets, right? $1 per device and stuff like that. But as they start to, proliferate the industry and, it becomes a different type of company, right? Then their monetization model then shifted into a subscription-based and a transaction-based model away from a product pricing for that widget kind of a thing. So they became, instead of a hardware IoT company, they became almost like a data and analytics company. Right, so those will be more interesting models rather than a pure hardware company on one hand. So, but asset-heavy, asset-light, it really depends, and it's very use case specific as well. I think we would look at companies that zoom in and really understand what is the core differentiating factor within their business model or technology, right? So, for example, if it tries to solve a certain problem in the industry, and it might not be a global problem, it might be a localized problem. It might be, a problem only in Vietnam or only in Indonesia, right? Those might be interesting to look at as well, right? Because again, not everybody is building to be a Google of the world, right? So again, the startups need to be very clear in terms of what is their core differentiating proposition and where they are at in the value chain, and whether or not, it's scalable enough in the place that they are in the value chain. I think that's very important, right? And then once you understand that value chain analysis and the scalability of that, then then come talk to us. Yeah, okay. Top 2 or 3, kind of opportunities in the space that you think will be interesting to look at, moving into the future.
I have a very long list. I know. One topic we didn't talk that much about is platforms, in fact, marketplaces. It is e-commerce is a marketplace, but there are also freight marketplaces. I think this is a highly interesting space. Also to say at that point, we are talking solutions, right? We're talking solutions. We don't talk technologies. I talk solutions. They come in stacks. And a marketplace is a wonderful stack of a place for a wonderful stack of different solutions. The next is there are many marketplaces already. So how can you deal with all the marketplaces? Which means there is another area which are the TMSs, transport management systems, and to build or to look into what is the optimal transport management system to manage marketplaces. Then there are the operational platforms, that's the IoT. And again, a thought which comes to my mind, if I had a wish what this logistics industry should be, I would like to complete the project I started 30 years ago and make it a data-driven, paperless industry, right? data-driven. And we are really at the beginning. But to do this, you need operational platforms producing the data. You might, and also in this context, you might need to become a producer of certain devices if the devices are not good enough. And then you need to see how you manage the cash flow, and that can be solved in many, many ways, financing, supply, whatever. So this data thing, and your point on going from descriptive to predictive to prescriptive, right? Which is, in fact, you describe what is happening, IoT, you have the data, to predictive, you already have an idea that this engine will fail, and this is a very old thing coming out of the aviation industry. And today, when I was in the plane, I said, I would like to know if you take the fleet of Singapore Airlines, whether the fleet of Singapore Airlines on planes creates more data than the entire logistics industry. It could be, because a plane creates enormous data, right? And that is also where people have to look at. But that's a bit, so my wish list, and what is the predictive one or the prescriptive is the one who can solve demand forecasting, can create whatever business model he wants and be more successful than anybody else because he takes inefficiencies out. Whether you sell ice cream or books or you run ships, if you know what is the demand for next week, next month, if you know the market prices, and this is not something maybe to look now, but maybe yes, but if you can predict this, in fact, how a market evolves, then you have found the holy grail for successful business.
Okay, and with that, whichever startups are in predicting market forces, probably have backers here as well. All right, so with that, thank you very much to the panel for the very insightful discussion, and we'll hang around here as well if there's any other one-on-one questions that you need for us. All right, thank you very much for coming this afternoon. Thank you for the panel as well. Thank you very much.
You have to answer one question now.